I'm the contributing editor to Unlimited Hangout, and have been an investigative journalist and researcher for about 8 years, and previously worked for Mint Press News as their senior investigative reporter. There's a coordinated global policy push for digital IDs as the new form of government-issued identification credentials. And they're essentially all based on your biometric data, which can be your fingerprints, your face, the iris of your eyeball. And the idea is essentially to collect all of that data and have it housed or have it tied directly to your digital ID. So your physical ID will be mapped to the digital ID. Digital IDs are not really a separate project from CBDCs and this new digital financial system. And UN documentation and also documentation from the Bank of International Settlements, they very overtly state that CBDCs and digital IDs are meant to go together. And without digital IDs, the CBDC digital finance system cannot exist. One of the reasons it can't exist without that is because of the KYC functionality built into this digital financial system. They have the know your customer protocols. They have to know who you are. And so they want to have your wallet tied to a digital ID and have that digital ID be mapped to your physical ID through the biometric data collection. So there's different efforts to make digital IDs either as NFTs, non-fungible tokens. There's also the efforts of Sam Altman of OpenAI and his WorldCoin project, whereby you scan your iris, you give them the biometric credentials of your eyeball. They give you a unique identifier, a digital ID, and it's inherently tied to a digital wallet. That is the same model the UN is using. They've already implemented it for refugees getting food assistance from the World Food Program. It's called Building Blocks. It's on blockchain. It involves refugees scanning their irises, and in order to buy food or receive their rations, they have to check out of a grocery store style place in the refugee camp, and they check out biometrically with an eyeball scan. And then the amount of food they have, the monetary value of that is subtracted from their digital wallet connected to their digital ID and their iris. It doesn't matter what country you're in or whether you're part of BRICS or part of the collective West. This is being rolled out across the board. One of the main reasons for this coordinated global push to develop digital IDs is because it's deemed essential to the entire Sustainable Development Agenda, which is the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, also known as Agenda 2030. And the specific part dealing with digital IDs is within SDG 16, which is about building peaceful and inclusive societies. One of the indicators of SDG 16, 16.9, calls for legal identification for everyone in the world from the time they're born, essentially. The leading alliance that was launched under the auspices of the UN to accomplish that is known as ID 2020 and has since been folded into what is called the Digital Impact Alliance, which essentially has the same funders and founders as ID 2020. So ID 2020, the UN and other stakeholders in this particular sphere often argue that the reason this is necessary is because of what they call the identity gap. And the identity gap is the claim that the lack of digital ID is preventing people, mainly the world's poor, from accessing essential services, whether it's banking, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare. They claim the only way for these people to be able to access these services is to onboard them to these identity schemes. So what they mean by essential services is, they say without these forms of recognized identity, people in the world, mainly the world's poor, are unable to access bank accounts, unable to access healthcare, unable to access government services, a variety of things, because they don't have ID or they don't have bank accounts, things of that nature. So in order to allow everyone to access all of these things and include them, hence the frequent word of inclusion in all these documents, they say digital ID is the necessary way to bridge this identity gap. One of the main words they use to market this stuff is equity and inclusion, the idea that we need to include everybody in these new systems. But if you don't participate in digital ID, you won't have a legally recognized identity, you won't have rights, you won't be able to access services without it. So it's being framed as promoting inclusion, but the system itself is inherently exclusionary and has been used to track and surveil people, to link people to, essentially all their activities, what they say online in some of the countries that have rolled this out, and has been used to facilitate human rights abuses. So it's not exactly as inclusive as they like to claim. It's inclusive in the sense that we want everyone equally included in our new system that we're creating, our new control system, fundamentally. The UN likes to talk about human rights and how this is ultimately a human rights project and things like that, or how it's empowering human rights. But in other documents of the UN, they refer to human rights not as inalienable rights, which is what most people think of when they hear the term human rights. In some of these UN documents, they refer to human rights explicitly as policy tools, or tools that can be used to basically implement, specific things and mechanisms that ultimately give, greater control over really any aspect of your life that they may want to influence. These guys also admit that the digital ID and CBDC is meant to be the same thing, and there's some very illuminating policy documents in this regard. So, for example, there's this one UN document called the People's Money, they call it, and it essentially talks about creating a citizen-centric, SDG-aligned digital financial system, which is obviously the system that we've been talking about. And what they say in there is essentially once your savings and your money is onboarded onto the system, they feel that they reserve the right to access and use your funds to develop and implement the Sustainable Development Goals or build the infrastructure necessary for it. So they essentially think that your money is their money. And if you look at how the UN sponsored groups like ID 2020 are constructing this, they're trying to hide behind a facade of decentralization and construct digital identity in a way that they call as vendor agnostic, meaning that any private company in theory could develop a digital ID system that people could use. So you'll have a variety of companies or government agencies issuing digital ID, and it will not look like a centralized digital ID, but it will be. Based on what's been developed so far by these entities, it seems like that database is meant to be housed at the World Bank, and it's called ID4D, and is sort of cloaked in the same rhetoric that ID 2020, cloaks their own project, claiming it's decentralized and all of this, but it's a centralized global data set where all these different digital ID systems can export their data to. The World Bank's interesting in the sense that, the World Bank, the IMF, they essentially use a debt slavery model to enforce policy objectives on national governments. And the World Bank has openly said that debt is a critical form of financing for the Sustainable Development Goals. So basically saddle a country in debt, and instead of having it enact austerity policies and things like that, it's to get them to enact digital ID. It's to get them to enact, financial inclusion, as they call it, with the CBDCs and their public-private sector equivalents, things of that nature. So that's how they force nation states to act as these enabling environments for these policies. A lot of it is through debt slavery, essentially. The UN very openly views the role of national governments only as enabling environments for these policies. So the national governments aren't meant to develop these policies themselves. They're meant to enforce these policies developed by the UN and their stakeholder partners, groups like the World Economic Forum, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and then enforce those policies on the public.